Good day, everybody. I hope that you are well, and I also hope that you are having a good day so far. Today, we'll be doing our grade 8 English lesson on direct and indirect objects. And before we start, we're going to log on to aplusstudents.ca. Once you've logged on to aplusstudents.ca with our username as well as our password, and then we're going to select the subject of English language arts. We're doing grade we're doing grade 8. And then we're going to scroll down up until we get to our chapter of direct and indirect objects. So, direct and indirect objects. All right. So, our chapter is direct and indirect objects. Our subject is English language arts. We're doing grade 8. And the lessons that we are going to be focusing on under the chapter of direct and indirect objects, is it a direct object or an indirect object? So is it a direct object or an indirect object? All right. So when it comes to a direct object, right? A direct object is a pronoun. So a direct object, it is a pronoun. It can be a noun or a noun phrase that receives the action of the verb. It receives the action of a verb. And in order for us to find the direct object in this of the sentence or in a sentence, then it means that we need to locate the verb, meaning you need to find the verb, or the action verb. And you need to ask yourself what or whom it is acting on. So we need to ask ourselves what or whom it is acting on. So once again, we see the direct object, it is a pronoun, it is a noun, or it is a noun phrase that receives the action of the verb. And in order for us to find the direct object in a sentence, we need to locate the action verb and we need to ask ourselves what or whom it is acting on. What and whom it is acting on. And if we look at an example, right, it says Jane admires her neighbor. Jane admires her neighbor. And remember we said we need to ask ourselves whom or what is it acting on, right? So whom is she admiring or who is he admiring, for example? So the question is whom does Jane admire? And we can say it is her neighbor. So her neighbor is the direct object within the sentence. Tells us whom or what it is acting on. If we look at the next one, it says Charlie baked a cake. So now the question is, what did Charlie bake? So what did Charlie bake? And we said he baked a cake. So a cake is our direct object in the sentence. It tells us what Charlie baked. All right. So that is basically our direct object. But we also have an indirect object. So we said we have we have direct objects and a direct object. It is the pronoun, noun, or noun phrase that receives the action of the verb. But some verbs, right? Some verbs that have a direct object can also have an indirect object. So some verbs that have a direct object can also have an indirect object. And an indirect object, right? We can say an indirect object is the pronoun, it is the noun or noun phrase that receives the direct object of a verb. Remember, we just now showed that the direct object, it tells us whom or what is it acting on. So now with an indirect object, right? This is the pronoun, noun, or noun phrase that receives the direct object of the verb. And an indirect object, right? It always appears in between a verb and its direct object. So an indirect object, it always appears in between a verb and its direct object. That is an indirect object. And in order for us to find the indirect object in a sentence, we need to locate the action verb and its direct object. And we need to ask ourselves to what or to whom the direct object is being given, or for what or for whom the action is being performed. All right. And if we look at an example, right? If we look at an example, it says Charlie baked his mom a cake. So Charlie baked his mom a cake. We now need to ask ourselves, whom did Charlie bake a cake? For whom did Charlie bake a cake? And we can say that Charlie baked his mom a cake. So for his mom. And remember, we said that to locate the action verb, right? And its direct object, we need to ask ourselves to whom or to what the direct object is being given. And we see that the indirect object is in between the verb. Here we have the verb and the direct object, which is a cake. We will find it in between. All right. And if we go on to the next one, it says be you need to be careful, right? So before we go on to that one, it says that before we just go on to before we continue with indirect object, remember that when it comes to an indirect object, right? In order for us to find the indirect object, we will find the indirect object between the verb. So try to locate your verb and try to locate your direct object, right? And you will then find that word in between your verb and your direct object. Because remember, here we said that when we said Charlie baked a cake is the direct object. And now we go on over here and it says Charlie baked his mom a cake. Baked is our verb, a cake is our direct object, and the word in between will then be our indirect object. All right. And you need to be careful, right? You need to be careful not to confuse an indirect object with an object of a preposition. So there's a difference between an object preposition as well as an indirect object, right? And an object of a preposition, it is a noun, it is a pronoun, or it can be the noun phrase that comes directly after a preposition. And a preposition are words such as to, for, in, under, or during. That is a preposition. And if we look at an example, right, of an indirect object, but basically that comes immediately after a preposition, right? Or an object of preposition, then we would say Charlie baked a cake for his mom. So Charlie baked a cake for his mom. And if we look at this, right, especially for his mom, right, that is the object of preposition. And the reason why we say that's an object of preposition, because remember we said an indirect object you will find between the verb as well as the direct object, right? You will find it between the verb and the direct object. And whatever you find after the preposition, let's say, for example, like for is a preposition, that is the object of preposition, not an indirect object. All right, so now we're going to aplusstudents.ca, and then we're just going to go over what is a direct and indirect object again, and then we're going to our test. We need to say if is it a direct object or an indirect object. And once again, we said a direct object is a pronoun, can be a noun or a noun phrase that receives the action of the verb. And in order for us to find or to locate this direct object, right, within a sentence, then we need to find and locate the action verb, and we need to ask ourselves what, or we need to ask ourselves whom it is acting on. So we need to ask ourselves what or whom it is acting on. And then we see that an indirect object, right? An indirect object. So some verbs that have a direct object can also have an indirect object. And an indirect object is the pronoun, or it is the noun, or it is a noun phrase that receives the direct object of a verb. It receives the direct object of the verb. And with an indirect object, we say an indirect object, it is also the pronoun. It can be the noun, or it can be the noun phrase that receives the direct object of the verb, right? And remember, we said that an indirect object, it appears, or it always appears between the verb and between the direct object. That is where you will find the indirect object. It will be between the verb and between the direct object. And you need to be careful not to, or let's say before we go to that, right? Remember, we say that an indirect object comes between the verb and it comes between the direct object. And in order for us to also locate, for example, our indirect object, right? And in order for us to locate and to find it, we need to ask ourselves to what or to whom the direct object is being given, or for what or for whom the action is being performed. That is what you need to ask yourself when you are trying to locate the direct object. And we need to be careful not to confuse an indirect object with an object of a preposition. And how do we even know if it's an object of preposition? Firstly, we need to keep in mind that a preposition, that an indirect object, sorry, comes between an action, comes between the verb as well as a direct object. So, which means that if we, since we need to be careful not to confuse an indirect object with a preposition or an object of preposition, an object of preposition, right? Firstly, a preposition, it is words such as to, for, in, under, or during. So if, for example, either the pronoun, the noun, or the noun phrase comes directly after the preposition. So if the pronoun, the noun, or the noun phrase comes directly after the preposition, right? After the words such as to, for, in, under, or during, then that is a object of preposition. Now it's not an indirect object anymore. It is now an object of preposition. Because keeping in mind that an indirect object you will find between the verb as well as a direct object. Right? And if we look at an example, right, we say Charlie baked a cake for his mom. And that word for his mom is the object of preposition because it comes after the preposition, which is for. So that is not an indirect object. It is an object of preposition because it comes directly after the preposition, which is for. And it also does not appear between the verb, and it also doesn't appear between the direct object. So the verb is baked and the direct object is a cake, right? Right. So now we're going to do a few activities and then we are going on to our test. So we need to say, is it a direct object or an indirect object? All right. If we look at this one, it says, is the phrase in bold a direct object or an indirect object? We need to say if it's a direct object or an indirect object. It says Camille built her clients a sleek new website. Camille built her clients a sleek new website. We need to say if that is a direct object or if that is an indirect object. Camille built her clients a sleek new website. So sleek new website is a direct object or an indirect object. And if we were to choose our correct option of either direct object or indirect object, and then we would say sleek new website, it is a direct object. So sleek new website is a direct object. All right. If we look at the next one, it says the cashier handed Grayson his credit card receipt. We need to say, is that phrase in bold a direct object or if it's an indirect object? The cashier handed Grayson his credit card receipt. Is that a direct object or indirect object? And credit card receipt We can say this is also a direct object. It's a direct object. All right. Let's look at the next one, and then we're going on to our test. It says John's pediatrician prescribed him an antibiotic. So John's pediatrician prescribed him an antibiotic. So him, is that a direct object or is that an indirect object? Direct object or indirect object? And if we were to identify or say if him is a direct object or indirect object, then we will say this is an indirect object. And this is an indirect object because him you will find between the verb which is prescribed and the direct object which is antibiotics. All right, so now we're going on to our test where we are going to say, is it a direct object or is it an indirect object? And remember, an indirect object comes between a verb and a direct object. And when it comes to a direct object, then a direct object is a pronoun, noun, or noun phrase that receives the action of a verb. And in order for us to find the direct object, we need to ask ourselves, first locate the verb and ask ourselves what or whom it is acting on. We need to ask ourselves that. All right, so now let's go to our test where we are going to say, is it a direct object or an indirect object? It says, Coach King threw her swim team in an Coach King threw her swim team an end of season party. So Coach King threw her swim team an end of season party. So the word end of season party, we need to say, is that a direct object or an indirect object? So option one is a direct object or option two, an indirect object. And if we were to choose our correct object, right? End of season party is a direct object. All right, so option one, a direct object. The next one says Camille built her clients a sleek new website. So Camille built her clients a sleek new website. We need to say if sleek new website is a direct object or an indirect object, option one or option two. So sleek new website, is it option one, a direct object, or option two, an indirect object? And if we were to choose the correct option, then we will say sleek new website, right? That is a direct object. It's a direct object. Sleek new website. All right. The next one says we need to say if it is a direct object or an indirect object. Wendy owes Maki $20 for last night's dinner. So Wendy owes Maki $20 for last night's dinner. So Maki, is that a direct object or an indirect object? The word Maki or the person Maki, is that a direct object or an indirect object? And if we look at the word Maki, right? Maki is in between the verb owes and the direct object, which is $20. So we can say that is an indirect object. So Maki is an indirect object. All right, the next one says Harry caught Harry caught us a huge catfish for lunch. Harry caught us a huge catfish for lunch. We need to say if that is a direct object, option one, or an indirect object, option two. Huge catfish, option one or option two. And if we were to choose the correct option by either saying it's a direct object or an indirect object, and then we will say Harry caught us a huge catfish for lunch. So huge catfish, we would say that is a direct object. It's a direct object. All right. The next one says the pie shop owner. The pie shop owner happily baked Farah a fresh blackberry pie for her party. So the pie shop owner happily baked Farah or Farah a fresh blackberry pie for her party. So fresh blackberry pie, is that a direct object option one or an indirect option two? So fresh blackberry pie. We need to say if that is a direct object or an indirect object. And if we were to choose the correct option, then fresh blackberry pie, we would say is a direct object. It's a direct object. All right, the next one says Connor prepared his family a delicious herb roasted chicken for dinner. So Connor prepared his family a delicious herb roasted chicken for dinner. We need to say if delicious herb roasted chicken is either a direct object or we need to say if it's an indirect object. So delicious herb roasted chicken, is that a direct object or an indirect object? And if we were to choose the correct option, we would say it is a direct object. All right, so this is now the end of our lesson on direct and indirect objects, right? We said when it comes to direct and indirect object, a direct object is the pronoun, noun, or noun phrase that receives the action of the verb. And in order for us to find the direct object, we need to locate the action verb and ask ourselves what or whom it is acting on. And then we also have an indirect object. And in order for you to locate the indirect object, you need to that you can basically find or locate the indirect object between the verb as well as a direct object. And be careful not to confuse a indirect object with a preposition or an object of preposition. And an object of preposition is where the indirect, not even the indirect, the where the word directly comes after a preposition. All right, so this is the end of our lesson. Grade 8, thank you very much for joining the class. And I really hope that you have an idea of what, or better understanding of what direct and indirect objects are. So till next time, you must have a good evening further. Goodbye.